And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings and what I call responding to the critics on each Friday. Each Friday, I try to address, respond to, and refute articles, videos, books that have been written by the opponents of the full preterist view. And I'm currently involved in responding to an article written by Andrew Perriman back in 2015. Now, let me reiterate what I have said before. I have tremendous respect for Dr. Perriman. I really, really enjoy his writings. I've been privileged to have an exchange with him on the very subject of Babylon. And so this is just, in a way, this is kind of a follow up of something that I've already done earlier, but which wasn't public, by the way. He and I had that correspondence, and it was on a very small website, and so it wasn't even published out in the wider public. So the subject of his article was why Babylon of Revelation was Rome and not Babylon. I've already shared with you several of the points that he made. I want to look at number 15 again, a little bit more in depth, because the book of Revelation depicts for us a harlot city. And Perriman is aware of the fact that that designation of harlot, biblically speaking, is in the great majority of cases speaking of Old Covenant Israel / Jerusalem, who had become unfaithful to the covenant and committed spiritual adultery with her idolatrous neighbors. So Perriman is very well aware of that. So he says, point number 15. It could be argued that in the Old Testament, the metaphor of harlotry generally entails, notice that word generally, entails unfaithfulness to God or breach of the covenant. Now that's powerful. I mean, that's really, really powerful. For instance, for example, he says, quote, but you trusted in your beauty and played the whore because of your renown and lavished your whorings on any passerby. Your beauty became his, unquote, Ezekiel 16 and verse 15. But he gives this caveat, his objection. But in the Old Testament, the unfaithfulness to Yahweh is always apparent. Babylon the Great is not depicted as an unfaithful wife who plays the whore. Now, I'm going to contest that, all right? She is simply a prostitute. Nahum's denunciation of Nineveh, and he quotes from the book of Nineveh, chapter 3, verse 4, and he says that offers a very close and obviously relevant parallel. Well, I would contest that. So he says that Babylon in Revelation is the harlot, and it's true that in the Old Testament, the terminology of harlot is used, generally speaking, to refer to Old Covenant Israel who had broken the covenant, committed spiritual adultery. Well, we find that in Hosea, we find that in Jeremiah, we find that throughout all of the Tanakh of Israel's disobedience. Now, Sebastian Smolars, a very noted scholar, has written a book, a commentary on the book of Revelation. And he calls attention to the fact that in the Old Testament, the word that is translated as harlot or prostitute is used some 91 times. And he points out that in 86 of those occurrences, it is referring to Old Covenant Israel who violated Torah. Now, remember, Perriman admits that. But he says, well, that covenant relationship that had been violated is really apparent in the Old Testament passages. But it's not apparent in the book of Revelation. But is that true? Now, when I point out that Smolars observes that 86 out of 91 cases refers to covenant violation resulting in the entity being called harlot. Just keep in mind how rare it is or was in the Old Testament for a non-covenant city to be called a harlot. I mean, 5 times out of 91. So it seemed to me that just the preponderance of usage. Now, is it possible, theoretically, that John is using the word harlot or prostitute in a broad, generic, undefined manner, but is simply applying that term to Rome? Well, it's theoretically possible. But where does the evidence lie? Well, let's look at a corollary concept. This city called Babylon is a city that also said, I am no widow. Now, that terminology is found in the Old Testament, and it is used exclusively of Jerusalem being abandoned and judged for her covenant unfaithfulness, and thereby being called a widow. Now, normally you and I think of a widow as someone who lost their husband. Well, that's kind of a modern designation. In the Bible and in the Tanakh, a widow was simply a woman who had no husband. That could have come about through divorce, abandonment, estrangement. In Isaiah chapter 54 and 4, addressing Old Covenant Jerusalem that had been accused of adultery, would be accused of adultery, and that as a result of that would ultimately be cast off, the Lord nonetheless made a promise of the restoration of Jerusalem, the restoration of Zion. And he said, you will forget the days of your widowhood. Now look, if we're going to apply the terminology of widow as someone whose husband has died, then it must mean that God died. And somebody might object and say, well, that could refer to Jesus dying on the cross. Well, that's a little bit of a stretch because Jesus came to life. He didn't die, for sure. So if he came back to life, i.e. his resurrection, would that not mean that he's still married to that old covenant bride? Here we find some really interesting stuff in which the writer of Romans, Paul, writing to the Roman Christians who had been under the law, and he says, you have become dead to the law through the body of Christ. Now, mind you what he is saying. Mind you very carefully what he is saying. He does not say, as I used to teach, by the way, he is not saying, oh, the law died. No. You have become dead to the law. Now, let me ask you a question. Is there not a huge difference between them dying to the law versus the law dying? Well, of course there is. Let me give a real quick illustration here. Back before 1990, 91, somewhere along in there, East Berlin was under communist rule, right? But in 1990, and we all watched it on our televisions dramatically unfold, in which the wall, the East Berlin Wall, came tumbling down. Now, up to that point, we very often saw people escaping from East Germany. Now, what happened when someone managed to escape East Germany and go to West Germany where there was liberty? Well, here's what happened. They died to communism. They died to the law of East Germany. However, And see, that's a subjective reality, personal reality. But when the wall fell, when the East Berlin government fell, when communism fell, that's when the law of communism died. So there's a radical difference here. In the New Testament, we find the teaching that Jews who were coming into Christ were dying to the law, just like East Berliners were dying to communism when they escaped from East Germany. However, in the New Testament, we find the teaching that the law itself was about to vanish. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. That the old covenant, written and graven in stones, was in the process of passing away. And actually, 2 Corinthians chapter 3 speaks to us very eloquently about both aspects, both the subjective, individualistic escaping from the law, as well as the objective, corporate reality of the passing of the law. Because he says, we all, now that's obviously a collective idea, we all, beholding in a mirror, are being transformed from glory to glory. Now he's referring to all of those who had come into Christ through conversion to Christ. They were being transformed. But he also spoke of the old covenant law itself. The glory of that old covenant law was passing away, uses the present active. It's very critical to observe and to honor the distinction between individualistic liberty from the law and objective passing of the law. It's just a reality of the New Testament. Okay, so they were dying to the law. Their husband was not dead. He was alive. So then we come, and by the way, there are other passages that address this issue. Lamentations chapter 1. When God destroyed Jerusalem, he said she was sitting as a widow. Well, it's real obvious. Yahweh had not died. Jesus hadn't even died at that point. And yet here is Jerusalem being referred to as a widow. Do you see how that plays into Revelation chapter 18, where this city says, I am no widow? Well, let me ask you, to whom was the city of Rome ever married so that she could be cast off, divorced, and thus say or deny that by saying, I am no widow, I'm still married? Folks, who was Rome married to? You see, this is something that Dr. Perriman does not address. He does not address this issue of I am no widow, unless I overlooked it, unless I missed it. All right? So when you combine the fact that this city is a harlot, using the identical terminology found in the Old Testament to speak of Old Covenant Israel that had become unfaithful to the marriage covenant, i.e. Torah, and you couple that with the denial of saying, I am no widow, then you've got to ask the question, to whom was Rome ever married so that she could be put away and become a widow? And if we are talking about Rome saying, I am no widow, then if we're not going to say that she had been divorced and thus being viewed as a widow, then who was her husband? It certainly wasn't Yahweh. Rome was never, ever, ever married to Yahweh or to Christ. And I think it's real safe to say Jesus wasn't dead. In Revelation chapter 18, the Father wasn't dead. And so you cannot in any way, shape, form, or fashion suggest, oh, well, my husband is still alive. Unless you want to observe, unless you want to make the claim that Rome was somehow claiming, oh, I'm married. To whom? To whom? But if you admit that Babylon was Old Covenant Jerusalem, then it makes perfect sense to realize, now watch this, when the 10 northern tribes apostatized and committed spiritual adultery, Yahweh wrote a bill of divorcement against them. And he said, you are not my wife, I am not your husband. Hosea chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Okay? But God said that Judah was also going to have the same kind of a harvest. Well, what was the harvest with the 10 northern tribes? It was divorcement. It was death. God departed from them. And in Hosea chapter 6, verse 11, God said that Judah would also have her harvest, and it would be in the time of the salvation of the remnant. Well, guess what? Revelation 7 to Revelation 14 depicts the salvation of the remnant in the depiction of 144,000. And their salvation was just about to come. Okay, so here is Israel, the 10 northern tribes, committed spiritual adultery. She was called a harlot. She was called an adulteress. 3 times in Jesus' personal ministry, he spoke of Judea and Jerusalem as this wicked and adulterous generation. Now, I went over this ever so slightly last week, but let me repeat it to close this out. Since Jesus referred to Jerusalem and Judea as the adulterous generation, what would be the natural result, the natural consequence of her being that adulterous generation? Would the natural result not be either divorcement, meaning she would be a widow from that point forward, or death? Well, Revelation depicts both. Revelation 17 depicts Babylon as being destroyed with fire. But she's also depicted as the widow, Revelation 18. And what was Babylon guilty of? Now, this is where I believe that Dr. Perriman completely misses the boat. And let me just go over very, very quickly what I shared with you last week. Dr. Perriman sees 2 great cities in the book of Revelation. You have the great city, which is where the Lord was crucified, Revelation 11, verse 8, and you have the great city Babylon. And he says these are 2 distinct entities, 2 distinct cities. But last week I shared with you that simply is untenable. Because Babylon, Revelation chapter 16, is the city that killed the prophets. What city did Jesus repeatedly identify as the city guilty of killing the prophets? Well, it wasn't Rome. Jesus not once, not ever, not even a hint of a clue of a suggestion, ever suggested and pointed the finger at Rome as a city that killed the prophets. Jesus identified Jerusalem as the city guilty of shedding all of the blood of all the righteous shed on the earth. Revelation 18 describes Babylon as the city guilty of shedding all the blood shed on the earth. Are both descriptions accurate concerning 2 separate, distinct cities? I think it hardly fits the bill. So we have Babylon killed the prophets, killed the apostles and prophets of Jesus, and was called the great city. Well, guess what? Revelation chapter 11 depicts the great city Jerusalem, by Perriman's admission, as the great city. And what? She is where the prophets were slain. Remember the two witnesses? They're prophets. So do we have two separate and distinct cities guilty of killing the prophets of God? We have to be able to produce some evidence of that. And we have to be able to show that John was using that terminology and that description of the city that killed or shed all of the blood shed on the earth, killed the prophets, killed the apostles and prophets of Jesus, in a way distinctly and sharply different from how Jesus described Jerusalem. The terminology is the same, ladies and gentlemen. The description is the same. From Jesus, and by the way, Paul, 1 Thessalonians 2, 16 and 17. So you have Jesus making the description of Jerusalem, the one that killed the prophets. They'd kill her. They would kill his apostles and prophets. They would fill up the measure of their sin and be judged in that generation. Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 16 and 17 described Jerusalem in the same identical manner. And now we have John in Revelation describing Babylon as the city that killed the prophets, shed all the blood shed on the earth, had filled up the measure of her sin. And by the way, don't you think it's ironic that Revelation would speak of Babylon filling up the measure of their sin in such a short period of time? Go back to last week's video where I discussed this. And if that's an if that tall, if Revelation chapter 11 is discussing Jerusalem, as Dr. Perriman admits, then why doesn't Revelation chapter 11 describe Jerusalem, as filling up the measure of her sin? Yet not a word is said in Revelation chapter 11 in describing the great city where the Lord was crucified and that killed the prophets. Not a word about filling up the measure of sin. And yet we do have in Revelation 17, Revelation 18, the description, ostensibly, according to Dr. Perriman, of Rome filling up the measure of her sin by one persecution that we can verify, and a very tenuous, questionable, extremely brief persecution under Domitian, if there was such a persecution at all. I'm sorry, folks, that just simply does not compute. And I am out of time. Thank you so much for joining me on this morning's Morning Musings and responding to the critics. Be sure to join Mike Sullivan and me this afternoon, 6 o'clock Central, 7 o'clock Eastern, as we continue our look at preterist apologetics. You'll be glad you did. See you there.